Amina ran through the soaked alley behind the Ile Ileri market with her apron flapping like a tattered flag. She clung to a sack of unsold akara and a wet umbrella that had already lost a rib to the wind. Because if she did not pay the landlord by dawn, the iron gate would be padlocked and her little son, Kemi, would be out on the red earth after rain with a fever that needed clinic money. She had only 300 naira left in her palm. How do you choose between the life of a child and the rent that feeds the family beyond just one night? She wondered. And who would believe a poor lady helped an old woman in the rain when the guards at the compound counted only what could be paid? She had no idea then that this moment, her body leaning to shield a bent old woman from the harmattan breath wind and danfo horns, her only clean wrapper pressed like a blanket over a shivering hand, would arrive later like a key to a locked door. For the old woman's face was lined with names and histories, and Amina did not yet know she was mother to a billionaire CEO. The shock of that knowledge would make the city hush, but for now the rain kept talking, and Amina kept running. The only certainty was the cliff edge of dawn. In her ordinary world, Amina rose with a generator humming and a prayer on her lips. She rolled ekuru and akara on a dented rectangular stove in a room that smelled of fried palm oil and laundry soap. Folding the little fabrics of her life around Kemi and her younger brother Musa, she did business under the awning by the mosque where morning prayers spilled into barter and blessing. She kept to a code learned from her mother: give where you can, keep dignity where you must, and never beg with shame. Which was why, when the market's bustle split and an old woman needed a seat, Amina's hands moved before her worry did. The title of her life was simple: Survive hon, estly. But every honest day tasted like battle, and every coin saved was a promise. And so, the story that began with a poor lady helping an old woman felt ordinary until it did not. Her relationships were patchwork: neighbors who borrowed sugar and sometimes returned with gossip, Pastor Daniel who offered prayers and smiles, and Fatima next door who lent her a sari once. Little holds that kept her afloat and kept her believing that the world respected small decencies. The inciting moment arrived in a way that could have been a parable. An old woman collapsed on the wet steps outside St. Mary's Clinic, her satchel scattering medicine wrappers and a faded photograph. Amina, carrying her unsold trays, stepped forward and pressed the wrapper tight around the woman's shoulders and fanned her with the umbrella until a motorcycle medic could be flagged. The act should have been a soft thing, an exchange of breath and care, but a man in a dark suit, too cool against the drumming rain, watched from under a black Lexus visor as Amina handed over the wrapper and her own salt-sticky hand. Amina felt his gaze like a ledger being made, and she could not tell if it would cost her or save her, which rose into a small, sharp fear. And when the medic demanded payment for the ride to the municipal hospital and Amina fumbled empty pockets, the very real fear of eviction sharpened again. The old woman's whisper, "May Allah bless you, my child," muddled with the danfo horn, and something in Amina's chest rearranged itself into a promise to keep helping despite costs, even as the man in the suit closed his window and the rain continued to ask questions. From that small mercy sprouted trials that came like a stubborn fever. First, the landlord, Mr. Ebe, looming with his ledger and a cigarette, said the compound's owner in Ikoyi wanted the tenants gone by Monday, and that unpaid rent would bring men with padlocks, which forced Amina to pawn the little radio that warmed Kemi's evenings to buy 2 days' bread. That evening, Fatima, smiling and offering tea, pressed a note into Amina's hand and seemed like a steady neighbor. But inside Fatima's kind eyes, a rusted pattern of envy waited, and the note later turned out to be a demand: return the favor of the loan with 10%, or risk gossip spread to the compound committee. The market's noise grew meaner. Butcher smoke and the sting of pepper made Amina hide her face, and the polished SUV with tinted glass rolled by her stall twice in one day. The man in the suit left a discreet envelope on her tray. No money, only a calling card that said Chinedu Ize Holdings, an ambiguous gesture that left her palms sweating and suspicion like a tightening rope. The first pattern interrupt arrived the next morning when a rumor began pulsing through the market that a famous CEO was in town scoping a philanthropic project, and people's voices turned softer and louder at once, like a crowd balancing hope and hunger, leaving Amina staring at a card she could not afford to accept and could not afford to lose. Obstacles multiplied. The municipal clinic demanded payment to keep the old woman under observation, or she would be discharged to the streets. The bread seller hiked prices, and Musa fell ill with a fever that made Amina's hands tremble over the pot. Each failure to meet the city's small economies felt like a personal failing. Pastor Daniel, always a man of good words, offered a church appeal in front of the courtyard and promised Amina he would collect for her rent. But later, when she came to the church, his clipboard had the donation columns filled with other names, and his smile was thinner than it had been. He'd quoted scripture and given blessings, but never the cash he'd promised. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a gentle betrayal that bit deep because it had worn holiness to mask cowardice. The market's bustle turned to a kind of ledger where kindness held weight, and every unpaid debt became a loud drum, each beat another demand from life that Amina had no note to answer with. Yet still, the man in the suit's car was seen by a street vendor watching from under a corrugated awning, and the city hummed with new questions about who really ran the money, because rumors of a billionaire arriving always made the Danfo horns sound different, like they were calling names. The midpoint twist snapped like a sudden drumbeat. She tried to fight back by taking a day job washing robes at the mosque and relenting her evenings to mend trousers for the tailor in exchange for coins. But Fatima's betrayal cut further when the neighbor pawed through her small savings and took the coins hidden in a sweet tin, claiming she had helped Amina by borrowing, and then denied it when Amina confronted her with tear-slicked eyes. This second betrayal cracked something in Amina that was not strength, but the careful trust she had kept like a lantern against cold nights. The city's contrasts struck hard then. Outside, the Ikoyi skyline glittered like a foreign shore across the lagoon. Glossy cars peeled across bridges, while Amina slept on a mat as the generator hummed and the Danfo horns carried dreams away. The Wealth Gap was a daily film strip, a polished elevator in a downtown tower versus the communal kettle on her courtyard roof, expensive perfume penetrating the air of the CEO's car when it stopped to let out a suited passenger, and the smell of burnt oil from her pot. Pattern interrupt. In the middle of one long, tired day, someone pressed a scrap of photograph into her hand. A picture of the old woman, young and smiling beside a boy who looked like the man in the black suit. And suddenly the small acts she had done were placed into a grid where a larger meaning could be read, leaving Amina holding a paper that felt like a map to a secret she could not fully understand. Then came the seed of kindness that would later bear fruit in ways neither Amina nor the market could have expected. When the old woman, whom everyone called Mama Nkechi, was discharged and shivering in the clinic courtyard, Amina took off her own damp wrapper and wrapped it around Mama Nkechi's thin shoulders, sat with her on the step until the clinic nurse left, and walked with her 2 blocks, carrying her bag, guiding her toward the pedestrian bridge as if she were a daughter. It was a concrete kindness. Amina bought the old woman a plate of jollof from a roadside vendor and insisted she eat it while the harmattan dust settled into the city crevices, and she offered the old woman a place to rest under the awning of her stall until a relative could be located. But more important, it was witnessed by a young security guard at the luxury hotel across the road, who knew the man in the black suit and later mentioned the scene into the CEO's ear. The guard's words reached the wrong ears at first, rumor teeth gnawed at the edges, and then reached the right ear, the CEO's, who happened to be in town to look at a new business opportunity. This small act of sharing warmth, of giving without expectation, closed into a small knot that would not unravel even as storms hit. And yet Amina still did not know the magnitude of the knot she had tied. Time compressed thereafter. The landlord's padlocks would come at dawn unless 30,000 naira appeared. The clinic threatened to send Mama Nkechi to a charity ward, where care was sparse if no one claimed her by sundown, and Kemi's temperature climbed steadily toward a breaking point, all three alarms ringing together like a chorus that demanded immediate answers. 3 days, the market buzz said, as if an invisible calendar had been slapped across Amina's life. She hustled extra hours, refused a small mercy from a relative that required she degrade herself, and patched her pride into a thin, frayed rope that somehow still held her and her children. The man in the black suit's calling card lay on the table like a coin that could be flipped. She considered going to his office, but feared the polished floors where people moved with other people's safety in their shoes, and the thought of a dieting pride made her throat tighten. Pressure cooker reality. If she did not, by dawn, doors would close on the life she had made, and if she sought help from men like the CEO, would she be mercy's guest or a curiosity? The old woman's faded photograph turned out to be the missing piece when a city official called Amina to the municipal hall and declared, with a paper that smelled of new ink and consequence, that Mama Nkechi was indeed the estranged mother of Chinedu Eze, the billionaire CEO of Eze Holdings, and that Chinedu himself had been the man in the black suit who had watched from his Lexus. This revelation reframed everything. Amina's small kindness was not a footnote but a hinge. The news arrived on a street radio, passed through the market like a mob of pigeons. People paused mid-barter as if the town's breath had been collectively held, and Amina felt the floor tilt beneath her simply because a man with wealth the size of a small town now carried a name that connected to the old woman she had wrapped in a wrapper. This revelation forced Amina to choose. Accept immediate charity that might humiliate or refuse the spotlight and risk losing Kemi's clinic care and her home, a choice that reframed the moral map of her journey and pushed her to remember what her mother had taught her about dignity. For a beat all seemed to stand still and then shatter. Amina watched Chinedu's car pull up to the municipal hospital as if the city itself had exhaled, and with it came the darkest moment. Pastor Daniel's gossip had been leaked to a tabloid that suggested Amina had been a con artist preying on the rich, and within hours the compound committee arrived with accusations and shouted testimony that painted her generosity as cunning. The landlord, having seen the paper and smelling scandal, increased his demands and claimed the padlocks were due to community standards, and Fatima's theft was brought forward as proof of Amina's alleged deceit, a twisted narrative where the victim became the villain. The market's sympathetic shoulders shrank. In public, leaving Amina exposed to shame in the middle of the square, Amina could have taken the hush money now offered by an intermediary, signed a paper promising silence and a modest rent payment, and kept her dignity as an internal ache. But she remembered the old woman's whispered blessing and the lessons of her mother. Truth, even when it cost everything, was the only currency that could not be counterfeited. She refused the hush money, choosing instead to stand naked before truth, saying, "I wrapped her because my hands knew what cold was." And that simple line, born of earlier seeds of kindness, became the shield she could not, would not put down. The climax unfolded like a film seen from both sides of a window. Chinedu Eze, enormous in both posture and wealth, did not merely act as a distant benefactor, but leaned into consequence, using his lawyer's letterhead and his voice in the compound committee's meeting to demand a halt to the eviction and a proper investigation into the rumors. The scene resembled the clashing of two Lagos, the polished, glass-paneled lobby of Ikoyi versus the red mud-rutted alleys of Ile Ileri. He walked into the market barefooted for a reason that shocked everyone who had seen his cars, but not his feet. And he confronted Pastor Daniel with a quietness that made the pastor's script crumble. Chinedu presented proof that Mama Nkechi had been registered under his mother's name in letters he had never expected to find, and he exposed the chain of slander that had been sold to tabloids for coin. The wolf in sheep's clothing, the pastor, sweat appearing like oil on his brow, had to answer in public for promises unkept and gossip peddled, and the landlord, confronted by Chinedu's legal team and faced with the prospect of a lawsuit that would force him to the magistrate's bench, found his padlock purchases rendered useless. On screen, the man who had threatened to make the family sleep on the red earth after rain watched his power erode like wet clay in a child's hands. Justice landed with noise and with mercy. The eviction was stayed, the old woman was formally recognized and given immediate care at a private wing of the clinic while family tracing was pursued properly, and Chinedu did something that made the market feel its heart expand. He offered Amina a loan to open her own food cart with an agreement that she would be paid a fair wage and that her children would be placed in a scholarship fund he would seed. The antagonist's consequence was not merely fear of consequence, but actual material unraveling. Pastor Daniel's church council suspended him pending investigation, tabloids published retractions and had to pay small fines, and the landlord faced a complaint that would make securing another compound more difficult than locking someone out. The confrontation had been public, the court of community opinion had listened, and justice registered itself in visible beats. The man who had once suggested padlocks now counted his losses in reputational ruin. On the street people wept openly, and the Danfo horns announced change like a brass choir, while the generator hummed a different tune in the background, as if even the city's machines felt lighter. In the following weeks, the new normal folded into place. Amina's food cart, painted bright blue and named Mama's Kindness, sat under the mosque awning with a small metal sign and a line of regulars who tasted both the akara and the story. Her brother Musa found a part-time job cataloging goods at a small store with wages that meant they could pay school fees, and Kemi's cough cleared in the clinic where the nurses had smiles carved newly out of assurance. Chinedu did not simply disappear after the headlines. He walked market aisles sometimes, sitting on stools to talk to old women about their needs, signing scholarship papers on a sun-warmed bench, and making a promise in public to fund a renovation of the municipal clinic's maternal ward as a way of acknowledging that wealth had been used to correct a ledger of neglect rather than merely to buy forgiveness. The contrast between old and new was concrete. The red earth after rain still stained shoes, but now there were job cards and a small refrigerator for cold water at the kiosk. Where once the Danfo horns only shouted demands, now they sometimes toot out celebratory notes when the cart sold out before sundown, and the smell of fried oil was threaded with a sense of safety. What changed most was not the shine on the wealthy man's car, nor the improved gate on Amina's compound, but the town's recalibration of worth. Neighbors who once spoke in the soft gossip of suspicion now learned to see the dignity in steady work and quiet giving, and the market's children learned a version of ambition that included kindness as currency. Amina found new confidence, not because a billionaire had entered her life, but because she had refused to trade her truth for a plate of hush money, and because people had witnessed that decision and followed it with action. She became a small public figure not by choice, but by example, and she used that platform to hire 3 young women who had once taken her plates and hands and who now returned the favor in wages. The old woman, Mama Nkechi, reconciled with her son in a scene of awkward forgiveness under the mango trees, where they exchanged reluctant laughter and then memories, and the power reversal was not about buying the market, but about buying space for dignity to breathe. Kindness, the story taught, can be a quiet seed that grows roots long enough to reach the richest soil, and truth, even when it costs, returns a dignity that money cannot properly purchase. Never judge a life by one chapter, for the poorest chapter in a person's book can contain the very gesture That changes the ending. If this tale moved you, tell us in the comments what you would have done in Amina's place, and if you believe kindness still changes the world. Please like and subscribe for more stories like this. Share the tale with someone who needs a warm reminder, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next folktale that walks between markets and marble and asks the same hard questions with a soft heart. Morning after the interval, Amina unlocked the blue cart and tasted the sun-warmed air that finally came to Ile Ileri with a gentler bend. She moved with a new cadence as the market woke to a rumor and a plan rather than only hunger. The city had chosen to test kindness as a public instrument, and the thought of a briefing at the district hall filled her with equal parts hope and dread because she was about to step into a room where the price of honesty would be measured in ledgers and the room would murmur like a crowd watching a public reckoning. Two questions pressed on her lips at once. Could she keep her dignity in a room full of strangers who would be listening for a way to turn her story into a soundbite? And could she trust that a donor with a name like Chinadu Ize Holdings would actually mean what he said when he spoke of lifting a ward and a family out of the dark? The text she had waited for pinged on her old phone. A time and place, a map drawn in the margins of a city that learned to survive by reading the signs of generosity and risk alike. And the subject line that read, in plain letters, Foundation Briefing, Mama Nkechi, Amina, and the people who hold the door open. She gathered her notes, folded them with the careful respect she gave to every sacred moment, and stepped into the morning chorus of market cries, the generator's grumble behind the mosque, and the scent of palm oil that clung to the fabric she wore as if the day itself depended on her key, tapping her head a fraction above the fray. The immediate stakes felt concrete. If her plan did not land, the old woman's care would falter. Kemi's fever would rise again. The rent would threaten to choke the last strand of hope, and a city that seemed to be listening would turn away at the moment when listening mattered most. If it landed, a new normal would emerge, a partnership that honored work and dignity, a playground of opportunities for young women who could sew and sell and learn to manage money, and a clinic that would not merely treat fever but teach the city how to keep its promises. And so she breathed out, stepped into a metal glass foyer that smelled faintly of citrus and air conditioning, and found herself facing a line of people with notebooks, a few old women in shawls, a couple of market teenagers whose eyes widened at the sight of a social contract being drawn, and a man with a calm smile whose presence felt both foreign and dearly familiar, as if the room itself recognized him before he introduced himself. He cleared his throat, spoke with gravity softened by warmth, and said, "I am Chinedu, and I am here to listen as much as to lead." And in that sentence was the thread that would soon weave a new tapestry of obligation and trust, a thread that would pull the market into the private wing of a hospital without losing the street's voice or the open hands that had kept Mama Nkechi alive. Amina's heart jumped once, then steadied, because the room's hush held more than respect. It held a hinge she hadn't known existed, a hinge that could swing the concrete toward justice or press it toward fear. And the first of many questions rose, unspoken yet visible. Would the city allow a poor woman to share in the wealth that had always seemed outside her reach? And would the wealthy man's gesture be enough to show that wealth could bend toward mercy without breaking? The dignity that sustained it. The briefing began with a formal nod to the clinic's urgent needs, the wards, the medicines that vanished from shelves the moment a new patient came through the door, the scholarships that would keep a few bright youths from dropping out and joining the swaddled ranks of fear-filled labor. And then the tone shifted, as if the room itself decided to lean toward a future it had often framed as a charity case rather than a shared enterprise. A projector hummed to life and showed a map of Ile Ileri dotted with small blue pins. The women who stitched, the youths who carried crates, the nurses who kept vigil, the vendors who fed the hungry, the old women who carried memory as an emblem of the city's continuity. And a plan unfurled. a community-backed microloan program that would seed small stalls around the market with a guaranteed weekly stipend tied to shopkeeping training, a scholarship fund for once-displaced children who wanted to stay in school, and a maternal ward renovation funded by a foundation that would require a transparent board, annual audits, and a public quarterly report that would be read aloud in the market so that no family could hide behind silence again. Amina watched the room tilt in the direction of possibility as she spoke, her words simple and steady, the way a prayer is simple and steady when it has been whispered to a fire for 1,000 nights. She told of the radio she had pawned to keep a week of medicine flowing for Mama Nkechi. She spoke of the line of women who waited for a chance to lift their own children higher, and she named the kids who would benefit from a future affordable enough to touch every corner of Ile Ileri. A few men in tailored shirts nodded, a nurse with a chipped mug offered a soft, approving smile, and a vendor who had once muttered about "those others" spoke up with a quiet but firm voice. "We will keep watch, so there is no deceit in the numbers." The room's atmosphere shifted from polite curiosity to something like a chorus weighing truth against rumor, and in that moment a memory surfaced for Amina. Mama Nkechi's whispered blessing, the old woman's face bending into a smile that held both gratitude and a grandmother's stern insistence on honesty, and she found herself answering a question she hadn't anticipated with a line that felt like a vow. "If we pull the thread of this plan, we must pull it right and fair, so the market's voice is heard in every decision, and the clinic's care becomes a shared duty." The honest remark earned a visible flare of affirmation in the eyes of the board, and drew a subtle glance from Chinedu, who listened not as a distant titan of wealth, but as a man who had learned to hear the streets breathing and to act when mercy demanded a public stance. The middle of the afternoon brought the first pivot, a mid-paragraph storm that redefined who was in the room and why they were there. A junior administrator offered a draft agreement that would place a large part of the foundation's power into a formal committee led by 3 outsiders and 2 local business leaders, one of whom had a track record for hard-charging profitability and a history of questionable ethics. And as the papers shuffled and the air cooled with the air conditioning, Amina felt a tremor in her certainty, the fear that public money could become private leverage, that the poor would become tokens in a broader scheme of influence. And then a second tremor, a name spoken in the hall with a hush, Mama Nkechi's own past, a lineage that tied Chinedu to a history she had not told her own son, a secret that had kept him apart from her until now, a revelation so explosive that it could either fracture the man's philanthropy or sanctify it by tenderness. When a staffer whispered that the old photograph in Mama Nkechi's satchel depicted the young woman who had once taught a district's children to read, and who had, unknowingly, given birth to a fortune, the room's chatter turned into a chorus of awe and fear, and Chinedu rose with a calm that hid a hurricane beneath his tailored suit, declaring with a voice that could quiet a crowd, "The patient truth is never a threat, it is the medicine we need to heal." He disclosed, in measured tones, that Mama Nkechi was his mother, a revelation that transformed the room from a forum of suspense into a confessional of possibilities, and the most skeptical voices faltered as the city's power balance shifted in a single breath. The market's own mob sense of justice softened into a recognition that the wealth gap could be redirected by open hearts, and Amina's resolve hardened into a certainty that she would not let a single piu dossier tenite monti. Urson's fear dilute a plan designed to lift many lives. A guard who had watched the exchange from a side door, a man who had seen both Mam Nkechi's frail hands and Chinedu's broad shoulders, gave Amina a small nod that felt like an unspoken oath, and when she returned his nod with a shy, grateful smile, the first brick of trust formed in their new shared building. The climax arrived not with a thunderclap, but with a measured public act that bound the room to a future they could not yet name. Chinedu, stepping into the center of the hall with the quiet authority of a man who had learned that the loudest voice can be the one that keeps a promise, announced that the foundation would fund the ward renovation in full, that the microloans would be structured with a transparent loan-to-income ratio so that no family would slip into debt, and that the district would appoint a mixed oversight panel that included a nurse, a vendor, a mother who had just joined the program, and Amina herself, so that the city did not lose the street's perspective to polished walls. The crowd exhaled as if they had held their breath for months, and the whisper that had traveled from Mama Nkechi's pocket photograph to the hospital ward to the foundation's board now settled into a rhythm of hope. Pastor Daniel's influence evaporated as credibility dissolved in the glare of audited numbers. Fatima's envy found its edge dulled by visible accountability, and even the landlord's leverage dimmed in the face of a public ledger that could not be forged. The boss of the market stood a little straighter when he saw the relief on a line of mothers who had once stood in the rain with empty bowls and hot tears, and who now walked away with a promise that their children could be clothed, fed, and schooled. Amina's own principal victory was not money paid to her in secret, but a contract written in daylight, a chance to stand behind a stall with a name that carried a story that was not her own alone, but theirs. And in a moment when she could hear Kemi's fevered breath behind her, she whispered aloud a line that felt heavier than the city's tallest tower. "We did not sell our dignity to buy safety. We bought safety by keeping faith with each other." The turning point was not just the public apology or the revelation. It was the unshakable sense that the wealth gap would now be measured by what a person did with what they had, not by what they kept, and the room, which had at first been a showroom for charity, became a workshop for justice, a place where the doctor could chart a patient's progress beside a young vendor who learned to count coins with the same precision he used to count smiles. The denouement closed some doors and opened others with careful kindness. The eviction ceased, the clinic's maternal ward received its facelift within weeks, and Mama Nkechi's care was placed on a permanent track of support that did not depend on a single donor's mood, but on a community's vigilance and a foundation's committed governance. Musa's apprentice-like duties expanded into a small business program that taught him to balance books while caring for his sister, and Kemi, now steadier, would go to school with a badge of hope pinned to his shirt. Fatima, confronted with her own part in the earlier whispers, stepped into a quiet repentance that came with returning the coins and offering a shared cup of tea to those she had wronged, while the old woman's son, who had first sent the rumor-riddled envelope of pressure, appeared not as a villain, but as a man who had learned that wealth could be a shield and a beacon at once when guided by a heart that remembered its mother's prayers. The market breathed easier, the Danfo horn sounded in notes of cautious celebration, and the night guttered with the warm glow of street lamps and the first glow of shop fronts that would not fade as soon as the sun rose again. The city's landscape of poverty and privilege remained, but its tempering had shifted, and Amina, standing beside Mama Nkechi at dusk as the clinic lights flickered on, understood with a quiet certainty that the real treasure was not the loan or the ward, but the moment when a dozen strangers chose to hold one another up at the brink of ruin, and when the billionaire's flag of mercy fluttered over the market, a banner not of conquest, but of shared home, the thread that had once threatened to snap. Fear of judgment, fear of hunger, fear of losing one's place, was now braided into a rope of collective care. And as night settled and the first stars pricked the Lagos sky, a new question drifted through the alleys and stalls. What next, when the city learns to measure wealth by the weight of its kindness as much as by its gold? The interval beat closed with the quiet certainty of a future in which Amina would not only feed bodies but feed hope, would not only clothe backs but clothe dreams, and would not only save a roomful of lives tonight, but lay the groundwork for a school, a clinic, a community, and a kind of justice that could travel beyond Ile Ileri to every market that believed it could still belong to the poor and the powerful alike. If you want to know what happens when a small stall becomes a conduit for a city's conscience, stay with us for the next chapter, where a boardroom and a marketplace collide again, and a hidden mentor reveals a new kind of wealth, the kind that is earned by truth, spoken aloud and kept alive by hands that refuse to let fear turn the pages of a life into a ledger of losses.